Hello, this is the lecture video to accompany the material on John Locke, which is basically section 6.2 of your text. Well, not basically, it is section 6.2 of your text, beginning on page 310. And we're looking at Locke as the second of the empiricist philosophers that we've talked about. Of course, Aristotle was the first empiricist philosopher, and so we're going to see some similarities between what Locke says and what Aristotle says because they both fall into the same intellectual tradition, both in their epistemology and their ontology or their metaphysics. So just like Aristotle was an empiricist in his epistemology and a materialist in his metaphysics, same is true of John Locke. He is an empiricist in his epistemology and a materialist in his metaphysics. So the opening pages here, the opening section rather, of the opening paragraphs of this section, John Chafee, the author of your textbook, is again sort of situating John Locke within this debate that we are establishing here between the empiricist and the rationalist philosophers. So we've seen that rationalist philosophers accept what is referred to as the doctrine of innate ideas. We saw this both in Plato and we saw this in Descartes. This notion that we are born with certain ideas already sort of preloaded in us. We saw that with Plato whenever he was arguing that in that excerpt from the Meno, whenever he was arguing that we have certain mathematical and geometrical concepts, ideas that we're just born with, that we just come into the world with certain ideas already present. And we saw that with Descartes. For example, his notion of God. What Descartes said is that we just come into this world with this idea of God already in our heads, and that then we rely upon that idea. It's like, well, I have this idea of infinite perfection. I certainly didn't encounter infinite perfection while on a walk in the woods, and so therefore the only way I could already have this idea of infinite perfection if it were placed in me, placed in me by God Himself. And of course, a good and gracious God won't allow me to be deceived about that which I perceive clearly and distinctly, so therefore we can go on to establish other truths, other articles of knowledge with that idea already in place. Now, a couple of things we want to emphasize here, though, is that the rationalist is not committed to saying that everything is innate, right? That certainly isn't the case. There are certain articles of knowledge that you possess, right? That I'm holding my beloved pineapple whip cup in my hand. That wasn't an idea that you were born with. That is something that you know as a result of what you are observing. The rationalist is just committed to the idea that some ideas are like that. Now, empiricists reject that. Empiricists are going to say no, there are no ideas that are innate. We come into this world tabula rasa. That's a Latin expression for blank slate. And then we have experiences. And then as a result of those experiences, we have this intellectual residue. And that intellectual residue is the idea. But what the empiricist is going to emphasize is that we don't have any ideas apart from these prior or antecedent experiences. Experiences first, ideas second. So the other of what Chafee calls the two pillars of rationalism. One of them I just finished talking about, the doctrine of innate ideas. But there's this other pillar of rationalism known as rational intuition, and we saw how both Plato and Descartes use the concept of rational intuition, right? We saw Plato use it where we just sort of rationally intuit the existence of the forms. What Descartes said is that we rationally intuit our own existence. I don't know I exist because I happen to catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror one day, right? I know I exist because it's an a priori principle of reason. Non-existent things can't have thoughts. I clearly have thoughts, therefore I know I exist. That's what the rationalist philosophers mean by rational intuition. And John Locke, of course, being the good empiricist, he's going to be rejecting both of those, right? He's going to be rejecting the doctrine of innate ideas, and he is going to be rejecting that notion of rational intuition. What makes John Locke such, sort of a paradigm example of an empiricist he's going to say that, all of our knowledge comes from experience. We're not rationally intuiting anything, and there's nothing which is innate. So remember what I said several videos ago now about what we mean by rationality. Whenever we talk about rationalism, we're not just talking about a person who is rational. We're talking about a person who claims that reason itself is the foundation of all of our claims of knowledge. And so what John Locke is doing in rejecting the notion of rational intuition, he's not rejecting rationality per se. P-E-R-S-E is the spelling of that. It's a Latin expression that means as such. He's not rejecting rationality per se. He's rejecting rational intuition. He's rejecting this idea that I can come to know something simply by, rubbing my temples, stroking my chin, and intuiting something. That's what's being rejected. So this section here, Locke's critique of universality. I'm just going to go over this really quickly. There are some resources embedded in this module that cover it more in depth. But essentially, what John Locke does is he criticizes rationalist philosophers on the grounds rather of them using this so-called universality argument. Think of Plato. Plato is going to say that's like, well, everybody's born with certain ideas of geometry already in place. Think of what Descartes says. Descartes says everybody's born with this idea of God already in place. And what Locke points out is, well, very clearly that's false, right? Just think of the dumbest person that you went to school with, right? That person wasn't necessarily born with certain ideas already, in place. There's lots of people that don't know the Pythagorean theorem, right? There's lots of people that lack those things, those ideas that Plato would argue are innate. Think of Descartes' notion of God, right? Descartes says everybody was born with this idea of God, and again, that's clearly and demonstrably false, right? There are people that are born in sub-Saharan Africa that do not have a conception of God in the way that Descartes says that is innate, right? They certainly don't have that conception of the Judeo-Christian God, which is the God that Descartes was arguing was knowable through an innate idea. People that were, born in China 2,000 years ago certainly didn't have any awareness of the Judeo-Christian God because they were sort of intellectually isolated from that. So we have all kinds of counterexamples to this notion of, the so-called universal idea. So John Locke, on empiricist grounds, is going to say, well, the rationalist are just making some unfounded claims here. We don't have a good reason to think that there is such a thing as a universal idea. But even if there were such a thing as a universal idea, John Locke says, we could come up with an alternative explanation for that so-called universality other than rational intuition or innate ideas. For example, you think of the common expression, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Of course, the reason why you can't have your cake and eat it too is because if you have cake and then you eat your cake, you no longer have the cake. Now, we can understand that expression as an extension of this principle of logic, that something cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. And most rationalist philosophers would say, well, that's an idea which is universal. Well, first of all, it's not entirely clear that it's universal, and John Locke uses the expression children and idiots right there. Children and idiots. I always like John Locke putting kids and idiots together in the same sentence because idiots, children, they're about as smart as, again, the dumbest person you went to high school with. Um, if you ask, 4-year-old little Timmy, it's like, is it true that, for any object X, it either exists or doesn't exist? Well, little 4-year-old Timmy clearly doesn't have that information. He doesn't have that idea, right? Now, could 4-year-old little Timmy come to have that idea? Well, sure. But what Locke would say is, well, that's the result of experience. There was a time I had a piece of cake in my hand. And the reason I don't have a piece of cake in my hand right now is because I ate the piece of cake. And so what John Locke would say is, well, that's not a truth of reason. That's a truth of experience. And maybe the reason why we find so many ideas in common is because all human beings are having fundamentally the same experiences. Every human being that has ever existed who has eaten a piece of cake has discovered that the cake was no longer there after they ate it, right? That's not a truth of reason, that's a truth of experience. So that is John Locke's argument against the so-called universality argument. And right here, the section of the textbook, that's Gottfried Leibniz sort of criticizing John Locke's criticism of rationality. What Leibniz is going to say is, well, we don't have to assume that these ideas are sort of perfectly formed from birth. Rather, we can assume that there's some sort of cognitive structure that is in place and under an optimal set of circumstances will develop in such a way that gives us these ideas. There aren't any questions on the examination about that, so I'm not going to get too deep into Leibniz's response to Locke. We're just going to continue with our understanding of Locke. So Locke's causal theory of perception. What Locke is going to say is that, this goes back to his empiricism. The reason why I have certain thoughts, the reason why I have certain ideas is because there's something external to me which is causing the sensation in me. So, to use my beloved pineapple whip cup, what Locke is going to say is that, well, the reason why I'm having a visual sensation of the cup is because there's a cup there, and the cup is causing this sensation in me. So notice there the connection between Locke's materialism and his empiricism. How do I know there's a cup? Because I see the cup. But what is the cup? Well, the cup is this material thing that is inhabiting space, which is the source of my sensation. So that's Locke's causal theory of perception. I'm seeing the objects because they're there. I'm seeing representations of the objects, more specifically, because they are there. Notice that, I say that there is a cup in this hand, and I say that there's no cup in this hand. I don't say there is a cup in this hand that I cannot perceive. I just say there's no cup in this hand. And the reason why I say there's no cup in this hand is because there's no sensory experience that would lead me to say that, right? But if I'm talking about this hand, I do say that there's a cup in this hand. And why do I say there's a cup in this hand? Well, I see it, right? I feel it. I can hear it. I have all this sensory information that is telling me that there is a cup there. And what is the source of that sensory information? This physical thing that inhabits a physical universe. So that's the connection between Locke's empiricism and his materialism. But again, I'll let you further explore the external resources to get a better idea of that. One of the major distinctions that Locke makes in this causal theory of perception is the distinction between a so-called primary and a so-called secondary quality. What Locke means by a primary quality are those qualities that are inherent to the objects themselves. Extension is the major one. What Locke would say is that this cup possesses extension, meaning that it is extended in time and space, roughly equivalent to what today's scientists refer to as volume, right? It's there. Now, because it's there, I can describe this cup in a myriad of ways. I can describe the color of the cup, and I can describe the texture of the cup. I can describe, the smell of the cup. It has a certain, stainless steel has that particular, smell to it, even has a particular kind of taste. But all of those are secondary, Locke would say, meaning that they are perceiver dependent. And so if it's perceiver dependent, it's secondary. The smoothness of the cup is not in the cup. It just feels smooth to me. If I were like Ant-Man, if I could shrink myself down really, really small, the surface of this cup wouldn't be smooth. It would be cavernous, right? It would be extremely coarse under extreme magnification, or if I were very small. But I'm not looking at it under extreme magnification. I'm not Ant-Man. I am experiencing this through my sensory net. So my sensation of smoothness is in me. It's not in the cup. Um, Again, I covered that pretty quickly. I'm going to refer you to some of those external resources so I can try to keep this video short. I've been going on for about 16 minutes now. And the rest of this material here, after Locke makes that distinction between primary and secondary qualities, in these paragraphs here, he is responding to Descartes. So Locke is writing after the time of Descartes. So remember that Descartes, the rationalist philosopher, is saying that our experiences aren't trustworthy, that our sensations aren't trustworthy. It's only the mind which is trustworthy. So therefore, we have to use rational intuition as the basis of knowledge, and we have to hold sensory information with a degree of distrust. And John Locke comes along and says, no, as a matter of fact, as it turns out, our sensory perceptions are actually quite reliable. Are they perfect in every case? No. But what John Locke's going to say, amongst other things, is that they affirm one another. Can any one of my senses be deceived at any given time? Sure, right? You're driving down the road on a hot summer day and it looks like there's a puddle of water in the middle of the interstate, but of course there's not. It just looks like there is. So your visual information, your visual system failed you. But if you were really in doubt as to whether there was a puddle of water in the road, well, guess what you could do? You could pull over to the side of the road and you can walk over and you can touch it, right? You don't have to rely on one piece of visual information. You have all these other pieces of information. So is it possible for one of them to go wrong? Yeah. Is it possible for you to, think your phone is ringing because you felt a vibration, right? This has happened to all of us. Say, ooh, I got a vibration there. My phone's ringing. You pull out your phone and just nothing. It's a brick. Of course, you thought your phone was ringing. The reason you thought your phone was ringing was because you experienced this sensation, this vibrating. But then you pull out your phone and you look at it, and you can clearly see that it is not ringing, right? So again, maybe one of your senses could be fooled. But what Locke is going to say is that, well, it's really unlikely that all of our senses could be fooled at the same time in the manner that Descartes suggests. So we don't need to have the kind of skepticism towards sensory information that Descartes does. Locke says we can hold sensory information as being, in general, reliable and as the basis of our claims of knowledge. So again, I left out a lot of detail there. I'm just giving the overview. So if I went over something too quickly for you, refer to those additional resources that are embedded in the lesson module. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. I'm going to ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I will see you in the next video.